This is the Mindful Crinks, and I am your host, Ron Purser. Usually, we think of Lululemon-wearing yoga teachers as the farthest thing from gun-touting, far-right Trumper conspiracist. Yet, during the COVID shutdown, when revenues from brick-and-mortar yoga studios dried up, and many prominent yoga instructors, as well as wellness influencers who saw big bucks could be made in the midst of the vaccine paranoia, these strange bedfellows were no longer strangers. I had the good fortune of speaking with Derek Beres, co-founder of the Conspirituality podcast, which I'm a big fan of, and about his new book by the same name, Conspirituality: How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat, published this month by Public Affairs. In this episode, we barely scratched the surface of this timely and eye-opening book, especially given the fact that Derek was deeply immersed and personally invested in yoga communities for many years. Not only this, but health and wellness has been his beat as a professional journalist. From anti-vaxxers and vaccine misinformation, to the paranoia of child trafficking and the satanic panic, to the body fascism of modern yoga and the obsession of body purity in the wellness industry, to the pseudoscience, magical thinking of New Age channelers, we unpack some of the main themes that have contributed to the frauds, the con artists, the hucksters, and the charlatans, many of which now thrive on social media with millions of followers. Derek Beres is a multifaceted author, speaker, and media expert. Based in Portland, Oregon, he has served in senior editorial positions at a number of tech companies and has years of experience in health, science, and music writing. He regularly speaks on science and media literacy. Derek is the co-host of the Conspirituality podcast. I hope you enjoy this episode. Derek Beres, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ronald.
Yeah, I guess we connected way back in 2019, I think. I remember when you interviewed me, and that's how we met.
That's true.
And we share a lot of concerns in common that I think be some interesting overlaps here today as we discuss Derek Beres' new book with his co-authors, Conspirituality: How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat, co-authored with Matthew Remski and Julian Walker, and published by Hachette and Public Affairs Imprint. Great publisher. Really good books coming out of Public Affairs. So congratulations.
Thank you. I was definitely happy landing that deal. They are a wonderful publisher, and to be among their catalog of authors is definitely a highlight.
It certainly is. In fact, our next guest is Tara Isabella Burton, who also just had a book come out with them as well. And well, so before we dive in, maybe a little bit about your background. I think that would be a really nice way to start.
Well, this is 30 years that I began as a journalist when I was at Rutgers. I was a religion reporter, and I spent 4 years there studying world religions and working for the school newspapers. So that kind of set the tone for the rest of my career in some ways. Being a journalist in those days was an interesting occupation, given that there was a transition from print, which is what I was working in, to digital. And as always, making a career as a journalist is challenging. So I also fell in love with yoga and movement, and I taught yoga and a lot of varieties of movement, cycling and kettlebells and different modalities for 17 years while I was working as a freelance writer. So occupying the position of being a longtime news and then entertainment and then health and science journalist, combined with being embedded in the wellness industry, being a yoga instructor and working in the festivals and creating music for yoga studios and experiences, all of those work together in interesting ways. But one of them, and I think this is one of the points we sort of agree with, is that you have these spiritual practices that are imported into this country, but also have the mark of this country in many ways. They're not such thing as a pure spirituality that's coming from anywhere to America. And it's filtered through this capitalistic lens that is required because that's what we're swimming in all of the time. And I was always been skeptical of a lot of the claims of the wellness industry, and specifically people talking about what you can and can't do with your health, what's possible, what sort of supplements work or don't work or have never been proven to work. And so in one sense, I was in these yoga spaces, loving the practice, being involved in a community, but then I would be reporting on science studies when I went home, and the two didn't match up. And that really all sort of led to my work co-founding the podcast with Matthew and Julian.
Yeah, I remember coming across a line in the book somewhere along the lines that it was a kind of an inner conflict or a cognitive dissonance at times. It must have been something that was like gnawing at you that may have spurred you into writing this book as well. Is that a fair statement?
I've never been that conflicted about it. I think the conflict was more for me, I'm speaking because there's three authors, so we all worked on different sections. My conflict was always in terms of social standing, and you're in this community that really believes certain metaphysical claims, for example, and you're there and you know these to be good people, you want to stay friends with them, but you also want to be true to what the science represents in your understanding of things. And in general, and I think this has changed a bit since the pandemic, people have become much more combative, especially in online forums. But in general, people involved in the yoga and spiritual scenes aren't really good with debate or conflict. And so for the most part, I would just keep quiet when I was in those situations. That's changed now because of the platform that we have. And I think it's important to call people out, but there was always a hesitancy to really get into debate. And that has changed somewhat. I wouldn't say totally, but it's definitely shifted.
Yeah, I think that really is a very important point, this shift from, and you're a veteran yoga teacher, this shift from face-to-face yoga studios, and then certainly with the pandemic, this shift to online wellness communities and yoga communities. And it's something you get into deeply in the book as well. There's this mass social media platform was growing and developing, and then COVID hit, and all kinds of things, crazy things started to happen. Is that right?
Well, when the pandemic hit, for example, to use an anecdote, my wife and I lost 70% of our income. And
Wow.
and I had some freelance work that was able to keep us afloat. But besides that, some people lost 100% of their income. So I understand why people would be stressing out and looking for different revenue streams. It just so happened that these social media channels did exist, and there were definitely cults of personalities that were bubbling up around some of the wellness and yoga influencers in these spaces. But then, there's always a danger of a little bit of knowledge leading you to thinking you know too much. And we saw that over and over with people who didn't have really good media literacy skills, and they would get sucked into conspiracy theories very quickly because you couldn't go outside. You need to monetize, you need to make a living, and you're noticing that certain hashtags are working really well to gain you an audience. And that was the pipeline that led from QAnon to the wellness community, which we identify in the book. And in some ways, I completely understand because I was living through it as well. But I also had pretty strong science and media literacy skills where not everyone has access or understanding of those. And I think that was a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's what's unique about your book, and particularly your own first person experience here as you're describing, is that you were an insider in many ways, living this profession as a yoga teacher. You describe this in the book as an online religion. And particularly interesting to me was that this mass marketing, this social media platform, was a delivery system for a soft eugenics. And I'm wondering if you can unpack that a bit, what you meant by that.
Okay, there's sort of two different things that went in there. The online religion part has always fascinated me. I've even before the pandemic, I was writing about what does the first cult in VR look like. Like, who's going to be able to understand how to indoctrinate people in virtual reality? Because it will happen at some point. But I think it was expedited through social media networks where, again, people who are locked in their homes, probably for most of us, the first time in our lives, we couldn't be social and be out there with people. And your only sense of connection was happening through these social media platforms. That is a very rapid indoctrination process. It's different than the brick and mortar style cult where you have to be in the presence of the leader, who's usually a charismatic person. Charisma doesn't matter as much when it comes to these online channels. It does for some people, but it's not as relevant. And so new forms of belief were springing up that really, I mean, they're not that different than old school religions. It's just the networks by which they proliferated are new. Now, leading into the soft eugenics, we talk a bit about the ideas of body fascism. And to me, early in my practice in the 90s, I was hearing instructors saying things like, you are your own best you are your own best doctor. You know your body better than anyone else. But concurrent with that, you also hear things about, if you can't do these postures, that means you have some emotional blockage. If you're unable to accomplish this, it's because of a moral failing. That's been part of some of the yoga rhetoric for decades, if not generations.
Mm-hmm.
And as it just so happens, it's sort of baked into the modern evolution of yoga from the late 19th century as well.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, and it cuts across religions. Of course, we focus on the yoga aspect, but the reality is not all, but a lot of forms of faith, and especially communities that form around them, have this idea of the pure body, or in Buddhism, the adamantine body, this idea that there's something that you can steel yourself with that makes you impervious to any problems, that you can transcend bodily problems. And it's not just a historical trend that is still continuing now with our supplements and our nootropics and our biohacking and longevity protocols, and with our fat shaming, with all of these different things that we look at our bodies with this sort of disgust and this idea that we can transcend that. So we just pointed out some of the trends by which yoga over the last 150 years has evolved with that step by step, and how it's continuing, especially with all of the body dysmorphia and image problems that people are having now because of TikTok and other social media channels.
Yeah, I'd like to dive into that a bit more, because you really devote several chapters on this theme of purgation and purification, and really, really quite a central theme here. And like you said, that the pandemic sort of inflected these hidden ideologies that were there all along historically. And what I really loved about the book is just how you really kind of trace these deep historical roots to many of these ideologies that seem to be lying latent and somehow came percolating up during COVID. It seemed like a perfect storm or catalyst to kind of supercharge these ideologies. And what I'd like to ask you, of course, is a direct question about how you stumbled across this term, conspirituality.
I think it was February of 2019 or 2020. So even before, when COVID was known, but before the pandemic created lockdowns in America, I came across this article on Medium by a British philosopher named Jules Evans, and he was writing about conspirituality. And it was from a 2011 academic paper by Charlotte Ward and David Voas. I immediately resonated with the idea behind it, because it kind of gave a term to something that I had identified in different ways in my own work. And so I wrote a Big Think article based on Jules's piece and also the original academic paper. And then a couple months later, lockdowns began, and I had invited Matthew and Julian onto my personal podcast, the one that you were on, Earthrise podcast, to talk about the pseudo-documentary Plandemic. I had been covering the anti-vax community for years at that point, with the measles outbreak in 2015, for example. So I'd already flagged that as a big problem. I knew the filmmaker, at least from my circles of Plandemic, and we just decided to run with the term. After 2 weeks of them coming onto my podcast to talk about the issues, we realized we had something that we could really sink our teeth into, because we all had individually been doing similar work from a different perspective. And I noticed that no one was using the term. As it turns out, Charlotte Ward, and we talk about this in the book, is a conspiracy theorist herself. The paper is written in such a way that it can be either critical or promotional. And it turns out we didn't understand that it was actually promotional of this idea, not critical of it. Even her supervisor, David Voas, who we'd been in touch with, didn't realize that at the time per se. Jules wasn't using the term. So I just took the term and branded it for us, and we've been running with it ever since.
Well, she's a very curious figure. It seems like, strange bedfellows here, the New Agers and the yoga moms with conspiracy theorists. And that's a theme that you discovered too, is that on the one hand, it kind of leans female gender-wise, right? And at the same time, the conspiracy theorists kind of lean more towards the males. And how do you think these strange bedfellows got together here?
Well, it's funny because, gender identity is such a
fluid,
polarizing and, hot topic right now. But what you just said is, yes, it's true. The original definition is the New Age, predominantly female left converging with the right wing, predominantly male conspiratorial right. But there is a lot more fluidity now between those communities. But in its true form, or at least in its original intent behind the definition, more women do yoga in America than men. More women are generally involved in wellness practices. Our listenership for our podcast, I believe, is about 75% women. So there is more interest in New Age and wellness topics for a number of reasons. And yes, the right wing is very male, at least in terms of the loudest voices. And of course, that's not true across the board. There are plenty of women who have kind of staked their flag or their gun in this point in those spaces as the marketing goes. But historically as well, it has been the case. So the last real indication of an emergence of conspirituality, you can point to the late 60s, when you had, at the same time, you had the John Birch Society coming out with all their conspiracy theories. And then you have the hippies on the left and the wellness practices also kind of finding the same inroads through fluoride and through government overreach. A lot of similar themes. And one thing I hope that becomes clear in the book, we are all fans of history. And sometimes, because our lives are so relatively short as compared to how long the Earth has been here, but also how long we understand at least some primary elements of recorded history of 7,000 to 8,000 years, is that themes are repetitive. And so we can find so many direct links from the late 60s, but if you go back to Emerson and Thoreau, we can find a lot of similar themes occurring as they're occurring right now.
And it seems like there is a common ground between the New Age yoga community and the extreme right conspiracy theorist. And you note in the book that what seems to connect them, they're both seeking patterns and hidden truths and obsessed with secret knowledge.
One of them one of them, apophenia, which Julian talks a lot about on our podcast, which is that you're looking for hidden patterns, and the more that you find, the more you think exist. It's really a cognitive bias that gets exploited, but that is we are pattern seeking animals. My personal feeling on where the crossover is in individualism. There is a deep sense of sovereignty that exists. And again, going back to what I've been experiencing in yoga spaces for so long, it's like, you know your body better than anyone. And that's simply not true. I mean, we have interoception, like being able to understand our body in space and the inner feelings. Yes, that's true. But I'm a cancer survivor. I didn't know it was growing inside of me for years before I identified the tumor. Like, I need someone to tell me that. Like, so, but it comes across in these New Age circles as if your health, if there's a problem with your health, that's on you and it's your problem. And that's also just not true. There are so many factors. And on the right side, you have individualism sovereignty that's usually expressed socially and politically. This idea that this very extreme libertarian idea of almost having no guardrails or rules in society, which is also just nonsense. What they both miss is the fact that we are interdependent and that there are many factors that come into the creation of a society. And if you want a healthy and functioning society, there needs to be some guardrails. And I think that both sides kind of live with that and have to in a lot of ways, but then philosophically, they believe they can transcend them, and that's a place where they align.
Yeah, you do make the point that during the pandemic, it was all about collectivism and the need to appreciate interdependence. Otherwise, masking and vaccines weren't going to be completely effective. And you note that it was an insult to these extreme libertarians that a zero point 0.5 milliliter vaccine could be universally effective to every human body, despite the fact that it's not appealing to their astrological sign or this hyper individuality was in conflict with the need for vaccines.
The currency of social media is binaries. And one thing that we often get a lot of is, oh, you think the vaccines work? You must be a shilling for big pharma. Right. And I often reply, if I reply at all, with a link to my previous book, which was very critical of the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to benzodiazepines and SSRIs in mental health care. And it's a book about psychedelic therapy, but half the book is talking about pharmaceutical industry. And it's almost as if we've gotten to such a place of polarization where people, like, complexity and nuance is gone from so many of these online interactions, which is really problematic. Because vaccines have never worked for everyone, and there have always been vaccine injuries from the very first ones. Like, that is well known. It's established. It's part of the unfortunate collateral damage of public health measures, and good public health officials admit that. And the problem with these binaries is that people will find someone who unfortunately was vax injured, and then they will hold them up as evidence of some grand conspiracy when they were unfortunately in the very small percentage of people who were, as I said, collateral damage of this extremely important intervention for a virus that that didn't exist before. So it's almost like people treat science as if the people who do it should have a 100% firm understanding of everything biological and that it's all settled. And I've talked to, between the podcast and then journalism before that, dozens and dozens of researchers and scientists and doctors over the years. And any credible one will never say that any science is settled. So we create these images of people that don't actually reflect how people actually are. And then we put them forward to create this straw man that only supports our argument. And that's the real issue.
What's interesting is that the reason why they had so much appeal is that they were attuned to some of these systemic problems, but they exploit it in a way. This pandemic of disenchantment, I think is the way you put it. They had this storytelling ability, which, like you say, circumspect scientists are not going to make grandiose claims, and they're kind of circumspect about it. Can you say more about that?
I think the ideal entry point to this is RFK Jr. right now, we're spending a lot of time covering, because he is the perfect embodiment of what you just expressed. He starts at a place that's very true. And in a recent episode, I start by saying I agree with him. Get all of the lobbyists out of Washington, the pharma lobbyists. They are the number one in terms of number of lobbyists and money spent in Congress. That should get rid of all lobbyists, but especially that industry. Get rid of direct-to-consumer advertising. We're one of 2 countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise directly, which is going to skew people to the point where many doctors often say people come in just looking for a prescription of something they've already made a judgment on, which isn't right. So you start from a place of real importance. We have a for-profit healthcare system here. I am about to transitioned to my sixth healthcare company in 3 years since the pandemic started, because of the pandemic and because of different jobs, and because I've been laid off from a few different companies, because working in tech and media, it's just common now. So we have to go to my wife's healthcare. Like, every time we do that, I have to get new doctors. I have to make sure everything works. I have to figure out new rates that I have to pay. It's really frustrating. These are all really, really important problems that I wish that politicians would focus on. What do you have instead? You have RFK saying some of these things, but then talking about thimerosal and vaccines creating autism. Thimerosal was phased out in 2001. Autism rates have gone up since then. The link between those two things already has been proven not to exist. You have him confusing ethyl mercury and methyl mercury over and over. He did it. He's doing it this week in podcasts. People don't fact check these things. And so you get this really skewed understanding where people are focused on the wrong set of issues in an industry that really needs reform. And that, to me, is one of the most frustrating aspects of it in general, because if everyone who was worried about corporate overreach and the ties to government, there is plenty to work on that we could be working on together. But instead, we're focused on these conversations about one of the most efficacious interventions ever devised by scientists over the course of centuries. And we're focusing on that and the idea that microchips are being put in, being tracked, and all of this ludicrous nonsense. And that's really sad to me, because I feel like if we all came together and actually pushed for legislation, but RFK is a free market guy. He thinks that healthcare and climate change are going to be solved in the markets and not by regulations. So he kind of backs himself into this corner where he can't actually address solutions that will help us. And instead, we focus on pseudoscience.
Well, that's really a good point, that we're not really steering people to policy solutions. And here's where conspirituality comes in, is that you have all this disillusionment and many other issues in our society, all this frustration, as you were characterizing your own personal frustration and fear of institutionalized medicine and the corruption of institutionalized religion. You have that on one hand, and it seems like that's the hook, is that the deep hook of conspirituality is that it's participatory. It's not a passive game, that it allows people to have a sense of agency, even if they're steered in these strange directions.
Yeah, agency is another term you can replace with individuality or sovereignty. In this sense, it's all works around the sense of meaning and wanting a sense of meaning to feel as if your contributions are worthwhile. But I go back to the lack of understanding of history. In the year 1900, there were just over 1 billion people on this planet, and the average lifespan was 48. I just turned 48. My father is going to turn 80 soon, and he's still getting around really well. And all of this is because of healthcare and better public health interventions and pharmaceuticals. Now, there are also a lot of problems with pharmaceuticals, but the idea that we have evolved as a society, and the idea that they're only a net negative is provably false. And that's what's so frustrating about the process, again, because there's so many things that we could be focused on. But I've had grandparents, I don't have them anymore, but like who were physically pronounced dead, who were brought back to life. My cancer, if I was alive in 1900, would have killed me by this point in my life, whereas it was a routine in a day surgery that I had to go through when I had it. And people lose sight of all of those important facets of our evolution, and they get caught in these narratives as if people always just live this way, and they're only a problem to us, and they're not helpful in any way.
So it seems like one of the ways that conspirituality functions is that it frames personal health as a spiritual crisis. Everything is a spiritual crisis. And somehow, whatever guru it might be, they have the secret knowledge, right? Or there's going to be this great awakening. And what did you see among some of these gurus and how they played that playbook out?
A great example is a crossover that Matthew and I had before we knew each other. This is going back 20 years. He was in two cults he writes about in the book. One of them was by this guy named Michael Roach, this Westerner who went to Tibet, became an ordained monk, but then took it in a lot of questionable directions and is continuing to do that. He was early on in the COVID making meditations to help you overcome COVID, like just a few months in. So he's still around doing this nonsense. But I started my yoga practice at a studio called Jivamukti in New York City. And early on in the early aughts, there was a language around what you were just identifying, which is if you can't backbend, it means your heart isn't open. That was a common one. Now, I've broken numerous bones in my body.
Mm-hmm.
I just how my body is and how my femurs sit in my sockets. I can forward bend very deeply. I cannot back bend very well. There's a pose called wheel that I've never been able to fully do. So I do bridges, and even those are difficult for me. So imagine you're in this space. It's purported to be a spiritual practice, and you have someone telling you, if you can't do this pose, your heart isn't open. And I'm sitting there struggling to get in the basic version of the pose that I'm hearing this. As it turns out, that language came from Michael Roach because the founders of Jivamukti were close with him, and all of the instructors had to go to his lectures when he was in New York City. And he was stating this nonsense, and then they were repeating it without actually really thinking about it. And so that's one example of how this body fascism just slides into these spaces, and people who are going there because whether it's they want to be healthy in their body or whether they're going through some trauma or they need some emotional healing or some psychological conflicts, they're being fed this. And people naturally, it's a little different now because people are so skeptical of experts, but people look to their teachers for guidance. And if you're just repeating this without actually thinking what you're saying, you're really going to affect people. So that's one example of how this predates the pandemic, but actually has continued through the pandemic. And it is indicative of how a lot of people feel about the relationship between their body and some spiritual ideal they're trying to live up to.
Yeah, you go back into history, even referring to a figure who I never knew about, Eugen Sandow, a late 19th century figure who changed his first name so it would sound like eugenics. I mean, that was just blew me away. But yeah, I mean, it seems like there's this another common theme that recycles itself is this fear of the other or fear of outsiders, kind of like almost a paranoia, fear of immigrants coming into the United States, for example. But that fear also applies to one's body, right? The impurities, these foreign substances, I can't allow them to enter my body. I have to completely purify my body. I mean, this keeps coming up in the book over and over again in different ways.
It's a really short walk between my body is toxic and I need to purify it to that group of people are toxic by their very constitution and we need to purify ourselves of them.
Like ethnic cleansing.
Yes, exactly. I don't think people realize how short of a walk that is. And we're seeing it all the time on social media. We see that sort of language exist. And when it does spill over into real world violence, that is obviously problematic. There hasn't been a politician who has completely harnessed that energy to the point of putting forward any mandates, but I would never say that it's not possible here because anything is possible, especially with the sort of heated rhetoric that's going on right now.
Yeah, this body is impure, this cleansing ideology. It's very interesting how it plays out in yoga, for example. You make the case of several figures. Well, we can talk about some of them. Bikram Chaduri in his hot yoga. Because there's a yoga studio just about a block away from my house that also was fined by the San Mateo County Health Department during the shutdown for conducting hot yoga classes. Yeah. But this idea that inner heat, right, will burn away these toxins. And that we have toxins that are blocking our energy flow. And it seems like this goes way back into history, that the body itself is conceived as inherently impure. What's going on with that?
Well, I would think that's why I gravitated toward Buddhism in so many ways, because it was all about, in some ways, rectifying those grandiose claims of the ego. I don't know historically when humans started thinking. We probably don't have a record of that, but at some point, consciousness gave us this beautiful ability to understand metaphors and use analogies to relate our experiences to one another. But then it gets co-opted in situations like this, where you think that eating a red food will automatically cleanse your blood because they're both red. And this goes back to apophenia, these connections of patterns that we see. And we talk about urine therapy, auto urine therapy in the book as well. One of the figures who drinks their own urine because it's a recycling process. And these all go back to our earliest mythologies. I mean, Persephone and Hades, the idea of leaving to go to the underworld for a certain amount of time and then coming back and being reborn. I mean, this is an agricultural myth because people were looking in their environment and then writing stories that told the story of the environment. But at some point, Edith Hamilton had identified it with Greek mythology personally, that we started to take these animals and nature or animal human hybrids, and then we started to put it all into the human form. So this is when the Greek statues started showing as if everything in nature and the world were embodied in our physical bodies. It's a lot different than understanding ourselves as part of the process. We started believing that we were the entire process. And that opens you up for thinking all sorts of pseudoscience. I mean, one of the earliest ones is the meridians in Chinese medicine. The idea that blood from certain organ or energy from certain organs flows through different channels in your body. Of course, there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of studies with sham acupuncture showing that that's just not the case. You can pretty much put a needle or not even put a needle in many places and people will report efficacy. But we have this mental image and this construct that our bodies represent all of reality. And that opens you up to believing all sorts of things.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting too was this notion of self-imposed authoritarianism. I guess you can see that in the extreme cases of the biohacking culture or extreme diets, like you're saying. But it seems to me that the reason why wellness fads are so successful is that we can never be pure enough. We can never be well enough. There's always something further to purify or purge. And it seems like that's where the wellness industry capitalizes and monetizes and exploits that. There's always more consumption. There's something more to sell. And you make a point in the book that it doesn't have to be an extreme diet for that to work. That this notion of, taking a picture of your green smoothie on Instagram, it comes right from that kind of belief system in a way.
Matthew said something early in the podcast that has always stuck with me. And it's the idea that the only thing that yoga instructors can sell is aspiration. And, it's a co-option of something that I think is really important. Like, we're always moving forward. We're trying to improve. We're trying to build systems better. We're trying to make ourselves better. Those are not inherently problematic things. In fact, you can say that one of the indications of depression is that you don't think tomorrow will be better than today. Yeah. So in some sense, it's healthy that we want to constantly improve. The extremes and the promises by which the wellness industry packages and sell that is the real problem, because you will always be chasing something. There's that sentiment, longstanding sentiment in this industry that we are who we're waiting for. This idea that all of history has led to us becoming this thing we are now. It's one of the most egotistical things I've ever heard, but it's regularly floated as some deep spiritual insight. And if you're always chasing something, again, going back to why I love Buddhism the best, because it's the cultivation of contentment. that you're really striving for. And that doesn't negate the fact that you can improve on things, or you shouldn't be doing things that make you healthy as you age. But it also reminds you to stop along the way and just to remember that it's not so bad right here where we are. And if you can take that mindset even into troubling times, I think that is a healthier way of being than constantly chasing something that's impossible to achieve.
Right. And I think that this aspirational aspect that you mentioned, how it's exploited, leads to this magical thinking too that plays into it. There's a lot of reference in your book about pseudoscience and co-optation of the language of science is one of their strategies. But also magical thinking seems to be the other side of the coin of that, right?
Yeah, they definitely work together.
Yeah.
You will constantly, one of the things we notice often is how some of these influencers will decry the medical system in every facet. They'll say, no doctor is telling you the truth. The
Mm-hmm.
researchers, they're all bought by big pharma. And you look and they very proudly flout the fact that they're a doctor. Like, doctor will be at the front of all of their handles.
Right.
Usually they're a chiropractor or a naturopath, but they want the credentials. And you see this all the time with these online or conferences. You'll hear about the rogue doctors. Pierre Corey plays this up all the time, a contrarian COVID doctor, because they're there to tell you, they've seen it from the inside and they're there to tell you the truth. So they'll flout their credentials when it works for them. They'll use the language of science when it works for them. I think of the time 15 years ago when creation theorists were using the idea that the God gene was found in the brain, the God molecule, whatever it was, by the pineal gland in the brain. They identified something that seemed to fit into their pre-existing notion of what reality was. And then they would use the language of their version of science constantly to try to prove a point. But that's not how science works. Science still works by consensus. And if it's only consensus of a very small minority fringe group, that's not really actual consensus.
Yeah. So it's sort of like the on and off switch. They'll turn on the science language switch when it suits them, but when they're talking to people at the conferences, they turn on the ancient wisdom switch. Again, it goes back to that all personal health issues are a spiritual problem, and we have the secret knowledge.
Yeah, and they don't see a paradox in that. They'll switch between those languages in the same sentence. A big red flag, I don't know if I identify in the book, but I've talked about this in episodes, is if anyone is talking about quantum physics. Like, that's the biggest red flag, because any actual physicist will say they don't know much about quantum physics. So when you hear Deepak Chopra or any of his acolytes saying quantum this or quantum that, just understand that person has no idea what they're talking about.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, this idea of manifestation, now there are manifestation coaches everywhere on YouTube.
Yeah.
New Age manifestation. And of course, Marianne Williamson has to come up here in the conversation. In Course of Miracles, she popularized it. But there are other figures like Esther Hicks, the law of attraction. Now we have the young, very attractive blonde woman, Elizabeth April, who seems to have taken the mantle there.
The channeler, yeah.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about this self-appointed channeling phenomena.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. You can hear a voice in your head and think you're talking to the Galactic Federation. Yeah, it's just incredible but it's also not new. I mean, there has been channeled wisdom texts for centuries at least, probably much longer. So it's actually, again, it's an example of something that happens to be an emergent feature of consciousness, which is this inner voice, which allows us to remember the past and perceive the future, which happens in the same neural networks. And there is this voice that's inside all of us that we hear that leads to our ability to communicate with one another. And then it gets co-opted through this bunk ideology that has this spiritual facade around it. And so it's really just charisma. And can you get people to believe what you're saying? That's really all it comes down to. Any one of us could say that we're channeling aliens and start saying things. And as we've pointed out numerous times, why is it always the most benign advice that they're giving that doesn't mean anything? It's always ambiguous.
It's
It
vacuous.
always, yeah, it has to, like, you're meant to do what you're doing. Like, if aliens were talking to us and they were futuristic, give us a cure for something. We don't have a cure. Like, give us something to work with. Never actually happens.
Well, it's not all that different from Tony Robbins bullshit too. I mean, and he's not channeling.
No, it's not.
But
No, he's not channeling, but he's one of the most egregious offenders out there to from my perspective. He really has his shtick dialed in, and I understand his appeal. The dude is big. He has a boisterous voice. He's very
yeah.
in command. But now he's behind this Sound of Freedom movie, which we're doing an episode on coming up, and he's just dabbling with a lot of shady characters at this point.
Wow. Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, it's very formulaic. If you look at it, it's very formulaic and predictable, as you
Yes.
say. It's very apolitical, the content. And I think it goes back to earlier when we first started, when you were talking about when you were in yoga studios, how difficult it is for the wellness community, particularly the yoga community, to deal with conflict or anything like that. So it seems like it's appealing in that sense. You mentioned in the book, and which really drives me crazy, is you just have to accept things as they are. That's such a platitude, spiritual platitude, and in the mindfulness movement as well.
Yeah, there's also a lot of paradoxes. You have to accept things as they are, but yet we're fighting for this cause that doesn't actually exist, but this is our spiritual calling. So if you were accepting things, then why are you fighting for this cause? There's that happens constantly. The apolitical aspect is something I don't think we might have glossed this over in the book, but in 2011, I moved to Los Angeles. And shortly after, in early 2012, I started a website called Yoga Brains with 4 other teachers in Los Angeles. One of them happened to be Julian Walker, and Matthew Remsky was one of our contributors. And it was a website that was looking at yoga and wellness from a critical lens through politics. And we were talking then about how problematic it was that the yoga and the wellness communities were so checked out of politics. They treated politics as an aberration, not as something foundational to society. And that's really troubling because they're enjoying the privileges of being able to live in a democratic republic without understanding the what it takes to actually make that function. And it really hit home for me in 2017, because in 2016, Trump won. A lot of people in Los Angeles, like myself, were really just distraught and confused by it. And in early 2017, we had the rallies that were some of the first women's rallies that were coming out. I was there. I saw tens of thousands of people mobilized politically many of them for the first time. In my head, I was like, okay, I live in sort of the mecca of the wellness culture in America. Here are all these people who are coming out, who are now politically mobilized. We're going to actually see a change in the voting patterns. And then that year was a mayoral race that put Eric Garcetti in office, and 13% of Angelenos came out to vote.
Wow.
And that kind of smacked me in the face, because I realized, no, they'll come in March and they'll hold a sign. But when it comes down to this is what needs to happen to make sure our city and our state and our nation are okay, I'm not going to engage in that. And that was really distressing to me. And even now, a lot of the political language that comes from wellness and these spaces that we're identifying are always conspiratorial, and they're not going to necessarily lead to people engaging in local politics. They're just going to shout about it online without actually having to do the work of going out and grappling with what that entails.
Yeah, you characterize it as being new age shills for the status quo.
Yeah.
And
Well, I just want to add too, like, I started my career in journalism as a beat reporter, and that required going to zoning board meetings and school board meetings in the 90s in these small communities in New Jersey. And they were boring as hell. But looking back at that time, I was like, oh, the zoning board meeting is where you decide what businesses you want to come into your neighborhoods, if at all. This is how you decide how you want your community to actually structurally work. And I realized at that time that that is where politics actually happen. And without that experience, I probably wouldn't have that same sort of understanding. So that's also what frustrates me about hearing these people pontificate about politics on these podcasts without it actually recognizing where politics actually happens.
And can we talk a little bit about just why are children so figural in the conspiratorial world? I mean, it's almost like there's an innocent child archetype at play. You have a couple chapters that address this. I'm also a skeptic of Rudolf Steiner and his bullshit. We talk about him and Waldorf. There's a case of a teacher, right, who took this job at a Waldorf school somewhere in New England. And then as she got into it, she kind of like, what the heck's going on here, right?
Yeah, Waldorf has long been anti-vax. I mean, so that's dating back over a century, right, with Steiner. The children, I mean, there's so many angles you can tackle that. I'll take two.
Yeah.
One of them I'm reminded of because Rena Raphael, who we interview in one of our podcasts, she wrote a great book called The Gospel of Wellness. She's a freelance journalist. I'm on her newsletter, and she put out one today about how Gen Z is very much about wellness being fun. And one of the hottest items in Gen Z health wellness are gummies because it reminds them of being children. And I kind of get that. You know, there's this longstanding sentiment of remaining childlike, but I think that we have to differentiate that from being childish. And a lot of what I see in wellness is childish, not childlike. The other thing is, I'm Gen X and I don't have children. It's a decision my wife and I made, and we're not going to, but a lot of my friends obviously do. And something does change when you're a parent, and there's a protective element that comes in, which I can at least viscerally understand through my experiences of seeing people with their children. And Eula Biss, in her book on inoculation, writes about anti-vaxxers. And one thing that's very strong, and this image has always stayed with me, is that compared to other health interventions, the mother can see the needle entering the child's skin. There's a puncturing of the flesh that leaves a mark in the parent's mind about the potential dangers of technology. Now, of course, these, again, are very often life-saving interventions, but you can imagine seeing the pierce and the pierced skin and the blood that comes from that. That imagery is very strong. And so, romanticized or not, we think about our childhood, and for a lot of people being a great time, not everyone, of course. And we have that image in our mind when we look through the younger generations. And so this protective element comes out. And so you have Sound of Freedom being the number one movie, with the topic being child trafficking right now. And it's something that has appealed to people. It was the QAnon pipeline into the wellness community, was child trafficking and the Wayfair incident. That's that and the anti-vax. Those things dovetail to create this whole movement that we're covering. And the protective element is important, but unfortunately, it's being run in a lot of ways now by people with ulterior motives. And so the whole idea gets confused for a lot of people. And I think that is where we start from. All of these things start from a place of truth, but then get co-opted along the way.
And it seems like it's algorithmic driven, this fear and paranoia surrounding a particular valid theme. And it seems like there's an exploitation of the innocent child archetype, that how vulnerable our children are in this very dangerous world. And at one time, what was this phenomena called? The satanic panic.
Yeah, that happened. I remember that growing up, but that happened when people were, and I'm not as versed, like Julian and Matthew really focused on those episodes. I didn't partake in them, but just from my own recollection, I mean, that was the late 80s, early 90s false memory, ideas, where this notion that we all suppressed trauma from childhood and that our parents were really abusive to us, or these father figures were really abusive and they took advantage of us, and all these repressed memories were coming to light. And that theme again has continued, and it's coming out right now with, again, Sound of Freedom. Like, these themes are continuing. This is an invented situation. It's made theatrical, and so it's affect. It's driving at people's emotions, which doesn't have to reflect reality, and that is a repetitive theme.
Yeah. And one of the big social influencers out there, kind of scary, is Teal Swan, another channeler. She capitalizes on parasocial relationships. She has that Hulu series. I couldn't watch it. I only watched a few episodes, and I was like, okay, I've had enough. But
we did
yeah.
a number of episodes on that. Yeah. And the film team went in with a somewhat critical eye, and actually some of them got a bit co-opted and drawn into what she was actually selling. Yeah, the parasocial phenomenon is real. Even from our listenership, sometimes people write to us saying, I feel like I know you. And I'm like, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that, because I listen to podcasts all the time, and I feel that way. I just don't act out on it. But I'm totally like, some people are like, oh, there they are again. And it gets back to the voices in the head thing, where we hear this voice in our earbuds, and then we start to create these relationships that don't actually exist. Teal Swan positioned herself to be able to speak to that in such a way as if you feel that you are. I mean, she literally created a group house where they met, and they didn't live together, but that they commune together often. And she is the great example of an old school brick and mortar cult leader who is forming an organization around her due to those parasocial relationships, because she makes it seem as if she's there for you. She's one of the more dangerous, because she's since walked back, but spoken of suicide as a feasible channel for people to take when the problems were too bad. And that when you're on YouTube saying those things, just think of the danger that creates.
Yeah, another danger is this figure, former chiropractor Joe Dispenza, who also capitalizes on these social relationships. And you tell a very sad story about someone who kind of got drawn in, who was suffering from or dying from pancreatic cancer, right?
Yeah, I've watched too many hours of him, and he goes on to these group workshops, and he'll say, I've seen disabled people walk. I've seen people cure themselves of cancer. Now, at the end of that, he's selling you breathwork and meditation, which he is prescribing, but he'll frame it in the language of, I've seen people heal themselves. It just so happens through the multi-$1,000 workshops that you're taking with me that happens.
Right.
He's very slick. He is only trained in chiropractic, but he constantly talks about his in-depth knowledge of neuroscience. And yes, we had someone on who, instead of seeing actual oncologists and doctors, used his protocols. And before they were able to get real help, they died. And we talked to her ex-partner about that. And that's not the only instance of it, but that's one of them. And if you talk to them, they will say that was not their fault, as someone like Dispenza, but it very much is, because they're making these grandiose, impossible claims about what they're offering. And when they actually have blood on their hands, they'll deny it. This also happened with Medical Medium. We recently did an episode on him with the journalist from Vanity Fair who came on, who got access to someone who died in his circle, to her cell phone, and saw years of messages and put together a really heartbreaking story. And how does he respond? Not by owning up to it, but by creating a 4-part podcast episode where he was the victim. And you see this over and over again.
Yeah. And you trace this is sort of like old wine in new bottles again. You talk about that he was actually a chiropractor for some channeler, another channeler from, was it J.Z. Knight from the Ramtha School of Enlightenment?
That's where he was around the time of the movie The Secret, which he was in. and that raised his profile
Ah,
quite a bit. And it was at that time when he was becoming a little too popular for Jay-Z Knight. So there was some internal politics there because, the acolyte can't be bigger than the deity, which as
yeah.
it goes. But that's where he grew up in that environment, doing spiritual chiropractic work for this channeling cult that exists.
Oh my God. And he appeared in that pseudoscience movie, right? What the bleep do you know?
Oh, that was it, not The Secret. What the Bleep? Well, he was involved in The Secret, but he was also in What the Bleep. That was where
Yeah.
that happened. Yes, that's correct.
A new age cult movie, which Mark
Hmm.
Vincente, who was the right hand man for you know who
Keith
in
Raniere.
Navidium.
Yep,
Yeah,
Raniere.
Keith Raniere. Yeah. And so it's really quite clever how they co opt, again, going back, how they co opt the veneer of science, make it all warm and fuzzy, the
Yeah,
language.
and yeah, I mean and people who are susceptible to it are people who might have health problems that haven't been attended to through their particular doctors or healthcare systems. And when, a lot of what I've noticed in my personal life are people who have some chronic problems who aren't helped, and then they turn to a medical medium because they're making promises. And part of it is when you go to a doctor, they will often prescribe a whole course of possible problems and remedies. And you have to try them out and you have to see what works and doesn't. And it can be a frustrating process. I've gone through it myself. With these wellness influencers and these charlatans, they make promises to you. They will very clearly say, I can heal this or that. And people get so swept up in that, they don't often notice that it's been months or years and they're still paying and they're not getting results.
So they're selling a false certitude in a way.
Often, very often,
Yeah.
yes.
And to what degree also do you think that the loneliness epidemic in America accounts for such the appeal of these charlatans?
The loneliness epidemic and combined with what happens in social media, they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
I don't know it's changed a little. I will say that I don't see as many people in Portland walking on streets with their head in their phone. I do see it. It's everywhere. I see people driving, which is one of my biggest, I can't even call it pet peeve. It's one of the stupidest things
Yeah.
that humans do is drive with a phone in their hand. But in Los Angeles, and even before that, when I lived in New York or go back to visit, the number of people in a line who are just on their phone, not engaging with other people, not engaging with the person servicing them, that disconnect from social relations then spills over more broadly. And so we talked about parasocial relationships, but the relationships with the people that they have with their devices, if you're indoctrinated into one of these spaces, like we've talked about over and over again, because your phone is your connection. And so the people on it become more important than the people in your life that could be helping. And of course, there are numerous, all of these are multivariate. There's no one solution or problem here, but it is a strong one. And you just need to go out in any city or area and wait in a line at a store to see that play out in reality.
Hmm. So as we conclude this, have you gotten a lot of hate mail as a result of the podcast? And I'm just wondering how you psychologically manage the pushback.
The way that I manage it is I remind myself that these are only avatars on a screen. And it actually kind of plays in to what you just referenced. I used to get more taken by it, but as the reach of the podcast and the book now have grown, I get more and more of it. And I understand that if I were to actually emotionally be taken by most of it, because there is some substantial constructive feedback that I do try to pay attention to, but the actual hate and trolling, I just remind myself that there's somebody at the end of that who very likely is lonely or dealing with their own problems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a critic. I've been a critic for a long time. I was a music critic for a decade. I find myself, I feel that criticism is an art and it's needed and it's important. And I
Well, that's
know
why you're
what
on
it
this
takes.
podcast as a fellow crank.
It's an important role. It's a very important role to be played, but good criticism can't be cynical. It can be constructive. It can be a little cynical sometimes, but for the most part, it shouldn't be, or else then you're going to get very nihilistic with what you're doing. And that's what I see, because it's not constructive. It's not reaching for anything that actually moves the conversation forward. It's often not even addressing the content. It's just someone typing saying, listen to me. And that's what I actually read when I see all of this. So that's how I don't get swept up by it or become too affected by it. It's sad sometimes. I can't say it's like I'm bulletproof. I'm not, but recognizing what's at the other end of that is pretty important.
I'm sure you've gotten a lot of emails as well that, based on the podcast and the new book, that, you guys have put your finger on something that I couldn't quite articulate, but thank you for really making it clear and provocative, right? Have you gotten emails like that too?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't handle much of our social media, but I would say at peak times, because they move in cycles, we get up to hundreds of DMs a week, and it's a lot, and I really appreciate it. I will say, I think what means the most is when we've had, I would say, in the dozens of people who were anti-vax, who listened to us in good faith, listened to the epidemiologists and the vaccinologists and the doctors and the people on our podcast who come on to tell their stories. And now they've vaccinated their children, whereas they weren't going to do that before.
Wow.
Getting those are really meaningful, because to me, that's real world impact that's going to make a difference in people's lives. So those are always really, appreciated. I mean, we're just doing what we do and we're trying to provide good information to people. They're making those decisions, but the fact that they took a moment out to say, hey, this helped me and I made this decision is really meaningful.
Derek Beres, thank you.
Thank you, Ronald. It's great talking to you.
This is the Mindful Cranks podcast. I hope you like our new look and feel, and check out our webpage at www.mindfulcranks.com. And subscribe to the Cranks newsletter to learn about upcoming guests and other events. The Mindful Cranks is pretty much on every podcast platform. Please rate and review the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or wherever you are so inclined. That's it for now. I'll be back soon with another amazing guest. Thanks for listening.